Normandy, 1944. A German officer is inspecting another knocked-out American Sherman. Burned-out tanks are nothing unusual, he's seen 100 of them. But this one has something on it he has never seen before. On the back of the hull, welded above the engine deck, there's a steel ammunition box. He opens it. Inside is a telephone. Not a radio. A telephone, the kind you wind by hand, the kind that hangs on a farmhouse wall. And it's wired straight through the armor into the crew compartment. Somewhere in the paperwork of a retreating army is a question no German officer ever managed to answer. Why would anyone bolt a telephone to the outside of a tank? The answer is one of the best stories of the whole war, and almost nobody tells it, because there's no famous general in it, and no famous battle. There are sergeants and welding torches, and men dying because they couldn't say one sentence to a machine 20 feet away. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll understand something about the American Army of 1944 that explains a lot more than one telephone. Start inside the tank. That's where the problem lives. A Sherman in combat is buttoned up, hatches sealed, 5 men inside, and the buttoned-up Sherman is very nearly blind. The commander gets a periscope, the gunner gets a narrow tube of the world. Everything else, the tree line, the hedgerow, the gun half dug into the bank 40 yards away, is guesswork. Now step outside and stand where the rifleman stands. He can see everything. He can see the anti-tank gun the tank is about to drive in front of. He knows exactly what needs to happen next, and he has no way on earth to say it, because the infantry carried one radio, the SCR-300, and the tanks carried another on completely different frequencies. 2 American units in the same field, fighting the same enemy, and they could not speak to each other. In June of 1944, men were dying of that, daily. So they improvised in the worst possible ways. They banged on the hull with rifle butts. Inside a roaring steel drum, the crew heard nothing. They fired tracers at the target and hoped the gunner noticed. And when nothing else worked, a man climbed onto the engine deck of a moving tank, in the open, under fire, and shouted into the commander's hatch. German machine gunners learned to watch for exactly that man. The after-action reports from Normandy say it in flat official language. Getting a message to the tank cost casualties. Think about what that really means. In the richest army on earth, the price of one sentence, "The gun is behind the second hedgerow," was sometimes a man's life. And the hedgerow country made everything worse. The bocage was a maze of sunken lanes and earthen banks grown over with centuries of hedge, country where a tank could be 20 feet from an enemy it couldn't see, and every little field was its own private battle. The Germans had machine guns dug into the base of the banks and anti-tank guns covering every gap. The infantry could get into those fields, but couldn't survive in them. The tanks could survive, but couldn't see. Each of them held half the answer, and between them stood a wall of silence. The 29th Infantry Division, bleeding its way towards Saint-Lô, actually tried to engineer its way out. Together with its attached tank battalion, the 747th, it ran field trials that summer, rigging spare interphone gear and field telephones so a foot soldier could plug into the tank. Not a headquarters program. A division, in contact, improvising with whatever wire it had. Those trials are on paper in the Army's own studies of the hedgerow fighting. Which brings us to the moment somebody, somewhere in Normandy, looked at an empty ammunition box, a spare field telephone, and the back of a Sherman, and got a welding torch. But before you meet the men who fixed the silence, you should understand why the silence existed at all. Because here's the uncomfortable part. It wasn't stupidity. It was the price of 2 brilliant ideas that nobody ever joined together. Rewind a decade, to a laboratory in New York. Edwin Armstrong, probably the greatest radio inventor America ever produced, spends the 1930s perfecting something called frequency modulation, FM, radio that shrugs off static. His reward is a decade of lawsuits from the broadcast industry, which has no interest in replacing everything it owns. But when the war comes, Armstrong makes a decision that tells you everything about the man. He hands his FM patents to the United States military, royalty-free. Take it, win with it, and the Army does. An engineering team at Galvin, the company you now know as Motorola, packs FM into a single backpack, the SCR-300. 38 pounds, 1 man, 5 miles of clear, static-free voice, the infantry's walkie-talkie. Meanwhile, the armored force gets its own FM family, powerful vehicle sets, built to let tank formations talk on the move. Both systems are world-class. German radio operators listening in couldn't even find FM traffic properly on their AM receivers. To them, the American nets sounded like silence. So why couldn't the rifleman talk to the tank? Look at the frequency allocations and you can see the seam. The infantry sets lived on one band. The armor sets lived on another, lower down, deliberately, so that a division's nets wouldn't trample each other. Each branch got a superb radio, perfectly engineered for its own war. And the 20 feet between a rifleman and the tank beside him fell exactly on the line where nobody's job description started. It is one of the oldest failures in engineering, and it has nothing to do with intelligence. 2 excellent systems, and no one who owned the seam. The Army's official answer would eventually come: committees, requirements, kit numbers. But the men in the hedgerows didn't have time for the official answer, which is why the actual answer came from a welding torch, and the man holding it had already broken Normandy open once that summer. Sergeant Curtis Calais, a tank crewman from Cranford, New Jersey, 102nd Cavalry, a National Guard outfit. In July of 1944, his squadron was chewing on the problem every unit in Normandy was chewing on. Tanks couldn't cross the hedgerows without rearing up and showing their soft belly to every German gun in the field. In a bull session about it, Cullen took an idea the others were half joking about and made it real. Don't climb the bank, cut through it, and the steel to do it with was lying on every invasion beach in Normandy. The angle iron obstacles Rommel had planted to stop the landings. Welded into a set of teeth on the bow of a Sherman, the German steel bit into the hedgerow and carried the tank straight through. Hull level, guns firing. Here's the part that matters more than the gadget. When his unit showed it to the generals, nobody formed a committee. General Bradley watched the demonstration in mid-July and turned every workshop in First Army over to building the things. Ordnance crews worked around the clock with welding gear salvaged off the beaches, and inside 10 days, hundreds of Shermans wore the teeth. The men called them rhino tanks. 2 weeks later, Operation Cobra cracked Normandy open, and the hedgerows had stopped being walls. Eisenhower told Cullen's story for years afterwards, by name, as his example of the thing he believed actually won the war. Not a secret weapon, but an army full of men who refused to accept that a problem was permanent. Cullen didn't come home whole. That November, in the Hürtgen forest, a mine took his leg. He went back to New Jersey, went back to work, and never once traded on the story. A sergeant, a pile of enemy steel, a welding torch. 10 days from idea to army-wide issue. Hold that in your mind. And now look again at the telephone, because ask who welded the first phone box onto a tank, and the records give you half a dozen honest answers. Tank battalions in Normandy claimed it. Ordnance companies claimed it. Units in the Pacific were rigging their own before some units in France had ever seen one. The recipe barely counts as engineering. 1E8 field telephone, the standard army handset, the thing signaled troops strung between command posts by the tens of thousands. One empty .30 caliber ammunition box, bolted to the rear plate to keep the rain off. A length of wire into the tank's own intercom. Total cost, scrap, and an afternoon. But look at what it buys. The rifleman doesn't climb onto the deck anymore. He crouches behind the hull, 30 tons of steel between him and the machine guns. Lifts the handset, and now he's inside the crew's conversation. A fifth voice on the intercom, as if he had a seat in the turret. And spare a minute for the men who did the welding, because they're the third character in this story. An American ordnance company in 1944 was less like a military unit and more like the biggest garage in the world, run by men who had spent the Depression keeping worn-out trucks and tractors alive because new ones didn't exist. Give those men a problem and a pile of scrap, and saying no wasn't in their vocabulary. They armored jeeps with boilerplate. They grafted machine gun mounts onto anything that moved. They built the rhino teeth in 10 days flat. When the phone idea reached them, it wasn't a proposal. It was an afternoon's work, and by evening, the tank was back in the line with a new box on the back. It spread the way the rhino teeth spread, workshop to workshop, battalion to battalion, without an order, faster than an order could have traveled. Nobody asked permission. Think about that for a second. In most armies in history, that sentence is unthinkable. In the American Army of 1944, it was Tuesday. So, did it work? The first real test was a machine gun in a hedgerow. Picture the standard Normandy problem. A rifle squad pinned along a sunken lane by a machine gun built into a hedgerow junction. Before the phone, that gun costs the squad an hour, and if it goes badly, a name or two on a casualty list. Because someone has to get the tank's attention, and getting the tank's attention means standing up. Now watch it with the phone. A rifleman works his way along the lane to the back of the supporting Sherman, takes the handset, and talks the gunner on, traverse right, the junction, 50 yards. Where the two banks meet, the turret swings, the 75mm fires twice, and the problem that was about to cost lives has cost 2 high-explosive rounds. The men who used it kept saying the same thing. What stayed with them was how ordinary it felt. You picked up a telephone, and a tank did what you asked. It mattered even more when the fighting reached the cities. Aachen, October 1944, the first German city the Americans fought into. Lieutenant Colonel Daryl Daniel, commanding a battalion of the 26th Infantry, boiled his doctrine for taking a defended city down to 5 words. Knock 'em all down. Every rifle company moved with tanks attached, and on every block, the drill was the same. Infantry stacked against a wall, tanks standing off across the street. The squad leader takes the phone. 3rd floor, 2nd window from the corner. The tank puts a round through that exact window before anyone crosses the open ground. The squad goes through the door of a building that's already stunned. Then everybody moves one address down the street and does it again. Man talks, tank fires, infantry moves, house by house, through a city the Wehrmacht had been ordered to hold to the last man. The Germans defending Aachen had armor of their own in those streets. There was no telephone on the back of any of it. And the phone had one more trick, one that nobody designed into it. The man on the handset was talking to the crew, but the crew was talking, through the tank's radios to everything else. Through that chain, a rifleman crouched behind a hull could reach the tank platoon, the company, and in a practice team, the artillery net beyond. Without knowing it, the army had turned every supported rifle squad into a forward observer. You can hear the result in the German interrogation files. Prisoners taken that autumn told their interrogators, over and over, some version of the same bewildered complaint. American fire came down too fast. Show yourself anywhere, and the shells arrived in minutes, as if the infantry were carrying the guns in their packs. The prisoners never worked out how it was done. Part of the answer was hanging in an ammunition box, behind the engine, on the back of a Sherman. The phone's hardest winter came last. In December, when the Germans burst out of the Ardennes and the war turned briefly back into 1940, the American line was held, and then unbroken, by exactly the kind of scratch tank infantry teams the phone was made for. Riflemen and Shermans who had never trained together were thrown into the same crossroads villages at a few hours' notice, in fog, in snow, at night. There was no time to learn each other's habits, no shared radio net, no rehearsal. There was a handset on the back of the tank, and that was enough to make strangers into a team by the second engagement. Men fought through the bulge in boots frozen solid, and the phone lines from those winter months come back again and again in the veterans' accounts. A voice from behind the armor, guiding a gun the speaker couldn't see, in country where 50 yards of visibility was a good day. And while all of this was happening in Europe, half a world away, in worse country, the same invention had already been born a second time. On the islands of the Pacific, the enemy wasn't in a tree line 40 yards away. He was in a cave mouth, a coral bunker with walls 6 feet thick, a spider hole between the roots of a shattered tree. A buttoned-up tank crew could stare straight at a fortified position and see nothing but rock and shadow, while the rifleman alongside had learned to read that ground the hard way, yard by yard. By the Marianas fighting in the summer of 1944, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Marine and Army tank crews were rigging field telephones to their hulls. Same problem, same fix, and no contact whatsoever with the units doing it in France. Out there, the phone stopped being a convenience and became the difference between a tank that lived and a tank that died. Japanese anti-tank tactics were built on close assault, teams of men with magnetic mines and satchel charges, waiting for armor that came forward without infantry tight around it. On Saipan, the tankers learned the arithmetic fast. A tank alone was a dead tank, and a tank sealed shut was a blind one. The phone let it stay sealed, and still see, through the eyes of every rifleman near it. By the time the Marianas were secure, the phone wasn't an experiment in the Pacific, it was equipment. Then came Peleliu, in the autumn of 1944, and the phone met the worst ground of the war. The island's central ridges, the Umabrogol, the men called it Bloody Nose Ridge, were honeycombed with hundreds of caves, cut deep into coral, sighted to cover each other, invisible until they fired. Watch one position fall. A Marine rifle squad is flat behind a coral shelf, pinned by a gun firing from a black seam in the rock face that none of the tank crews can pick out through their periscopes. A corporal crawls back to the Sherman idling in the drawer. The crew can hear the gun, can't find it, and takes the handset off the rear plate. The seam, left of the white scar halfway up. Watch my tracer. One burst of rifle fire marks it. The tank's 75 answers. The seam becomes a crater. The squad moves. Then the next cave opens up, and the whole conversation starts again. The 1st Marine Division worked those ridges for weeks like that. Tanks and riflemen functioning as a single organism, the infantry killing the close assault teams before they reached the armor blasting open the caves the infantry pointed onto. The best cave network the Marines had yet seen fell anyway. Position by position, phone call by phone call. By Okinawa, in the spring of 1945, the partnership had a name. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, commanding 10th Army, called it the blowtorch and the corkscrew. The blowtorch was the flame tank, the corkscrew the demolition charge, and the method was the patient, awful reduction of one fortified position after another. Watch it work, at the level of one cave mouth on one morning. A rifleman lies flat in the coral rubble, holding the line open, while a flame tank of the 713th Tank Battalion crawls forward. He talks it on, one correction at a time. Left. Slow. There, where the shadow splits the rock. The tank answers with a rod of fire. The infantry move in behind it. Then the whole team slides 50 yards down the ridge and starts again. Crews fought entire mornings that way, steered, sentence by sentence, by men they never saw. And on some tanks, when the wire ran forward, a wounded man lying in the tank's shadow could keep directing its fire while he waited for the corpsman. 2 theaters, 2 enemies, 2 completely different wars. The same ammunition box and the same hand-wound telephone, invented twice, by men who had never heard of each other. When an invention has no inventor, that tells you something. And it brings us back to the German officer's question, why would anyone bolt a telephone to the outside of a tank? And the sharper question, why didn't the Germans have one? Because here's the twist that makes the whole story land. The Germans were the pioneers of tank radio. Heinz Guderian, the father of the Panzer Force, had been a signals officer before he was a tank man, and he built his arm around a rule that seemed extravagant in the 1930s, a radio in every single tank. Receivers for all, transmitters for the leaders. When Germany broke France in 1940, the French had tanks with thicker armor and bigger guns, and radios in almost none of them. French tank commanders passed orders with signal flags. The panzers moved like a flock of birds, hundreds of vehicles turning on one voice, and the world learned a new word for what that felt like to be on the wrong side of. Blitzkrieg was, as much as anything, a radio net with tanks attached. So the army that taught the world to put radios in tanks, that army, never solved the last 20 feet. The net that made the panzers a swarm ran from tank to tank, commander to commander. It never ran down to the infantryman walking beside the hull. German infantry and armor talked to each other the way the manual said. Flares, hand signals, riflemen riding the engine deck, pre-arranged plans, and when those failed, men banged on hulls there too, right to the end of the war. It wasn't for want of brains, and it wasn't for want of improvisers. Every army's soldiers improvise. The difference was what happened to an idea next. A German crew that rigged a fix of its own had no channel for making it standard. Equipment came down from the engineering offices. Changes went back up through them, on paper, slowly, or not at all. The idea usually died with the unit that thought of it. The system pushed orders down. It had no pipe that carried solutions up. The American Army of 1944, an army of drafted plumbers, linemen, mechanics, and farm boys who had wired their own barns had exactly that pipe. And you've just watched it work. Twice, a sergeant cuts hedgerows with enemy steel. 10 days later, it's first army policy. Crews weld phones to their hulls, the army watches, agrees, and by the last winter of the war, the improvisation is a factory standard kit, an external handset on the rear plate, issued and installed as a matter of course. Notice what the generals actually deserve credit for here, not the ideas. For building an army where having ideas was every private's job, and where a good one could outrun the paperwork. And this one outlived everyone who welded it. 5 years after the war ended, on the frozen hillsides of Korea, the phone was no longer a field improvisation. It was built into the tanks at the factory, and a new generation of riflemen learned the same drill their father's war had invented. Get behind the hull, lift the handset, torque the gun onto the bunker. In the mountains, where Chinese positions were dug into reverse slopes exactly the way Japanese positions had been dug into coral, the tank infantry phone call was once again the fastest artillery on the hill. It went to Vietnam on the patterns, and if you walk around the back of an American M1 Abrams today, 80 years and a dozen wars later, you'll find, in a small armored box on the rear plate, a telephone for the rifleman walking behind. The crews call it the grunt phone. It is descended in a straight line from a scrap ammunition box and a hand-wound field phone, welded on by a maintenance sergeant whose name nobody wrote down in a French summer in 1944. The German officer in that Normandy field thought he was looking at a curiosity, a telephone in a steel box on the back of a dead tank. He was actually looking at the reason his report had no answer. Not a weapon, a culture, an army where the man with the best view of the war, the private, on foot, close to the ground, could always be heard, where the answer to a battlefield problem could come from anyone and be bolted on by Friday. The Germans never found an answer to that, because the answer was never made of steel. Before you go, I've got a question for you. Did anyone in your family serve? Tell me about them in the comments. A name, a unit, a story handed down. These files only survive because people take the time to tell them. And if you've stayed this long, 3 small things help keep this channel going. If you haven't liked the video, it takes a second, and it goes a long way toward putting this story in front of the people who'd want it most. Subscribe so you don't miss the next file. I open one every week, and share this one with someone who'd enjoy it. Until next time, take care.